ICE used a stun gun on a black man when it was not necessary. A prison sentence was handed down. It was a calm morning when the man stepped out of his small apartment to run a few errands. He had lived in the neighborhood for many years and was known to many as a friendly face who often greeted others with a smile. People described him as quiet, respectful, and someone who minded his own business. That day, however, his life would take a turn he never expected. As he walked down the street, a black government vehicle slowly pulled over near him. At first, he thought it was just another car parking on the side. But soon, two men in official jackets stepped out, and it was clear they were officers from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The man was a little surprised but remained calm. He had nothing to hide and no reason to feel alarmed. The officers approached him, asking a few questions about his identification. He answered politely, reaching into his pocket to show them his ID. His movements were steady and non-threatening. Several people in the area noticed what was happening. Some paused, curious to see why ICE officers were stopping him. The man spoke softly and explained his situation clearly. He was cooperative and did not raise his voice or act in any way that could be seen as aggressive. Despite this, the atmosphere began to shift. One of the officers looked tense, his hand hovering near his equipment belt. The other officer continued asking questions, but the tone grew sharper, as if they were searching for a reason to escalate the situation. Those who were standing nearby later recalled how uncomfortable the exchange felt. The man was calm, but the officers seemed impatient. The tension in the air made even strangers stop to watch. Some people pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Without warning, one of the officers reached for his stun gun. The man froze, confused. He had done nothing wrong, nothing threatening. His eyes widened, and he raised his hand slightly, as if to show that he meant no harm. The officer, however, pulled the trigger. In an instant, the sharp crackle of electricity filled the air, and the man's body stiffened before collapsing to the ground. A hush fell over the small crowd before gasps and voices broke out. People shouted in disbelief, asking why such force was used. The man lay on the pavement, trembling from the shock. His face showed both pain and fear, and his body twitched as he tried to regain control. He was not fighting back, not resisting. All he could do was endure the sudden wave of pain that had been forced upon him. The bystanders could not believe what they had just witnessed. Some recorded on their phones, their voices filled with outrage. Others stood frozen, unable to process the sight of a man brought down so violently without cause. The officer who had used the stun gun did not immediately seem concerned, while his partner looked uneasy, glancing nervously at the people who were recording. The man tried to speak, his voice weak, saying he had done nothing wrong. He lifted his head slightly, looking at the officers with confusion, but his strength was failing. The officer who had fired the stun gun gave short commands, but the crowd could see clearly that the man had never been a threat. A woman in the crowd shouted that she had seen everything and that he had been calm the entire time. Another man stepped closer, saying loudly that the stun gun was not necessary. The officers appeared unsettled, realizing that their actions were being watched and documented. Minutes felt like hours as the man lay on the ground. Eventually, he was lifted and handcuffed, even though he could barely stand. His legs wobbled, and his body leaned heavily to one side. The pain was still fresh, and his dignity was deeply shaken. The officers guided him toward their vehicle, but the eyes of the public were fixed on them, filled with anger and disbelief. The man was taken away, leaving behind a neighborhood buzzing with shock. Conversations erupted immediately. People who had never met him before felt a sense of injustice as if they had witnessed something that should never have happened. The woman who had shouted earlier replayed the video on her phone, and others crowded around her to see it. The footage was clear: a calm man, unarmed and cooperative, suddenly struck with a stun gun. Word spread quickly. Within an hour, the video was already moving across social media platforms. Neighbors who knew the man shook their heads in sadness, describing him as gentle and hard-working. They could not understand why such extreme force had been used against him. Back in the vehicle, the man sat silently, still shaking slightly. His thoughts were scattered. He could not believe that in just a few minutes, his life had shifted so drastically. He replayed the scene in his head, the questions, his calm answers, the officer's sudden decision, the shock that coursed through his body. He wondered what he had done to deserve it. The ride felt long, though it was only a short distance. He thought about his family and how they would react when they learned what had happened. He worried about the video spreading, but at the same time, he hoped it would show the truth of what had occurred. He knew he had been peaceful, and he hoped that people would see that and stand by him. At the station, he was processed like any other detainee, but the incident had already sparked something larger. The officers may not have realized it yet, but their decision to use unnecessary force had set off a chain reaction that would not easily fade. The man's pain was real, but so was the anger of those who had seen the injustice unfold. As night fell, the video had already reached thousands of viewers online. Comments poured in, most of them filled with outrage and calls for accountability. Civil rights groups began to take notice, preparing statements and demanding answers. News reporters picked up the story, eager to uncover the details of what had really happened. The man, now alone in a holding cell, closed his eyes. The sting from the stun gun still pulsed through his body, a physical reminder of what had taken place. But more than the pain, it was the feeling of helplessness that weighed heavily on him. He had done everything right. He had been calm, respectful, and honest. And still, he had been treated as though his life did not matter. He did not yet know how far the story would spread, or how many people would soon speak his name in support. At that moment, all he could do was breathe slowly, trying to steady himself, trying to believe that somehow, the truth would be seen. What he could not know was that this single moment would soon lead to a trial, a sentence, and a national con. The video of the incident traveled faster than anyone could have imagined. By the time the sun rose the next morning, thousands of people had already watched it on their phones and computers. It was not a long clip, but it was clear enough to show what had happened. The man was calm, he was standing with his hands visible, and then suddenly he was struck with a stun gun. The crackling sound of the device and the man's collapse made viewers feel shocked, even angry. It was the kind of video that did not need explanation. People could see with their own eyes that something was wrong. In the man's neighborhood, conversations started early. Neighbors stopped each other on the streets, talking about what they had seen online. Some were upset, others were heartbroken, and many were determined that the truth should not be ignored. People who had never spoken to each other before began exchanging thoughts and feelings about the incident. The sense of unity grew stronger as more individuals realized that they had all witnessed the same injustice. News reporters quickly picked up the story. Local channels showed the video in their broadcasts, and anchors spoke in serious tones about the need for answers. National outlets soon followed, with headlines questioning the behavior of the ICE officer and the reasons behind the unnecessary use of force. The story began appearing not only on television but also in newspapers and online articles. The man's face was blurred in some reports to protect his privacy, but the action of the officer was shown clearly, again and again. Civil rights groups reacted strongly. Many organizations released statements within hours, calling for a full investigation. Some groups held small press conferences, standing with posters and banners that demanded accountability. They reminded the public that this was not the first time an officer had been accused of using excessive force, but they insisted that this time there must be consequences. Lawyers, activists, and community leaders joined their voices together, creating a chorus that was hard to ignore. Social media became the main battlefield of discussion. Thousands of comments poured in on platforms where the video was shared. People debated what they had seen, but the majority agreed that the officer's actions were wrong. Hashtags began trending, linking the man's story to a wider conversation about fairness and justice. Strangers expressed their support, writing messages of encouragement and sharing their anger at what had taken place. The man's family was deeply shaken. They had seen the video too, and though it hurt to watch, they knew it was important that people saw the truth. His relatives spoke carefully to reporters, describing him as peaceful and respectful. They reminded the public that he had never caused harm to anyone and that he had always tried to live a quiet, steady life. His mother's voice trembled during an interview, saying she could not understand why her son was treated that way. Her words touched the hearts of many who listened. Meanwhile, the officer who had used the stun gun found himself at the center of public attention. The ICE department released a short statement saying that the matter was under review, but this did little to calm the outrage. People wanted more than just words, they wanted action. The silence from the agency only fueled suspicion that they were trying to protect their own rather than admit wrongdoing. The lack of a quick apology made many believe that accountability might not come unless the public kept pressing. Protests began forming in different parts of the city. At first, they were small gatherings, with a few dozen people holding signs and chanting peacefully. But as the video continued to spread, the crowds grew larger. People carried posters showing the man's face, along with powerful messages about dignity and respect. Some wrote slogans about equality, while others demanded reforms in the way officers handled their responsibilities. The protests remained peaceful, but the energy in the air was strong. Journalists followed these protests closely, capturing the images of people standing together in the streets. Children marched alongside adults, and older citizens came out to lend their voices as well. The man's story had touched people across generations. It was not just about one person anymore, it was about the larger issue of how people were treated by those in positions of power. As the days passed, more details about the incident began to surface. Witnesses who had been present during the arrest came forward to share what they had seen. Their testimonies matched what the video showed. The man had been calm, cooperative, and respectful. They explained how shocked they had been when the officer suddenly used the stun gun. These statements strengthened the case against the officer and made it harder for anyone to claim that the use of force had been justified. The man himself remained in custody during this time, but his voice was not silent. Through his lawyer, he released a short statement to the public. He thanked those who were standing by him and asked for peace during the protests. He expressed that he did not want anger to lead to violence, he only wanted justice. His words reflected his calm nature, even in the face of pain and humiliation. This message earned him even more respect from the public, who saw him as someone with dignity and strength. The story continued to grow. National figures, including well-known leaders and public speakers, mentioned the incident in their addresses. They pointed to it as an example of why reforms were necessary. Debates broke out on television panels, with experts discussing whether ICE officers received enough training and whether there was enough oversight. Some defended the agency, but the majority of voices demanded change. In classrooms and workplaces, people brought up the story during conversations. Teachers discussed it with students as an example of fairness and rights. Workers exchanged opinions during breaks, some sharing their own experiences with unfair treatment. The man's story had become a symbol, something larger than itself, sparking discussions that reached far beyond the original neighborhood. Late-night talk shows also touched on the subject, their hosts speaking in serious tones instead of humor. The image of the man falling to the ground after being stunned was replayed countless times, each viewing renewing the anger of those who watched. Celebrities and public figures shared the video on their accounts, reaching millions of followers and amplifying the call for justice. Through all of this, the man's family continued to speak with dignity. They reminded the public that behind the headlines and videos was a real person who had suffered. They asked for respect and patience as the legal process moved forward. Their calm approach won the hearts of many who admired their strength during such a painful time. By the end of the second week, the pressure on authorities had grown too strong to ignore. The government announced that there would be a formal investigation into the officers' conduct. Many people felt relief at this news, but they also knew that investigations sometimes ended without true accountability. Still, they saw it as a small victory, a sign that their voices were being heard. The man's name had become widely known, and his story was shared in homes across the country. He had not chosen to be in the spotlight, but now his experience was forcing a difficult conversation that society could not turn away from. His calm nature in the face of injustice, the dignity of his family, and the unity of the public created a powerful force that could not easily be silenced. The outrage was real, the support was growing, and the stage was being set for the next chapter, the legal battle that would decide not only the fate of the officer but also send a message about how justice would be delivered in cases of unnecessary force. The days after the protests were filled with restless energy. People wanted to see what would happen next. The video had made the truth clear, but the real test would come in court. Everyone knew that cases like this could be complicated. Sometimes, even when evidence seemed strong, the outcome was uncertain. Still, the man's supporters believed that this time, justice had a real chance. The government announced that charges would be filed against the ICE officer. The words echoed across news channels: excessive use of force, violation of civil rights. For many, hearing those charges gave hope. It meant that the system was at least willing to take the first step toward accountability. For the man, who was still recovering both physically and emotionally, it was a sign that his pain had not been ignored. Court proceedings began quietly at first, with preliminary hearings and documents being filed. Lawyers gathered evidence, and both sides prepared for a long process. The officer's defense team argued that their client had been following protocol and had acted in what he thought was a tense situation. They painted a picture of uncertainty, trying to convince the court that the officer had made a split-second decision. But the video stood as a powerful counter to their claims. It showed clearly that the man had been calm, his hands visible, his voice respectful. The prosecution built their case carefully. They collected testimonies from the bystanders who had recorded the incident. Each witness described the same story: the man was peaceful, and the use of the stun gun was unnecessary. Some witnesses even grew emotional on the stand, recalling how helpless they felt watching the scene unfold. The video was played in the courtroom, filling the air with the sound of electricity and the man's collapse. The silence that followed each playback was heavy, as jurors absorbed what they had seen. The man himself appeared in court, his presence quiet but powerful. He walked slowly, still dealing with the effects of the stun gun, but he stood tall. When he spoke, his voice carried both pain and strength. He told the jury about the fear he felt when the device hit him, the helplessness as he fell to the ground, and the confusion that followed. He spoke about the long nights afterward, where sleep was hard to find because the memory replayed again and again. His testimony was not angry, instead, it was steady, honest, and deeply human. The courtroom was filled with observers. On one side sat supporters of the man, including activists, family members, and neighbors. On the other side were law enforcement representatives, some there to show solidarity with the officer. The air inside the room felt heavy with tension, as if each word spoken could shift the balance one way or another. The defense tried to argue that the officer had no intention to harm, that he had simply been cautious in a situation that he believed might turn dangerous. They suggested that training protocols sometimes led officers to act quickly. But the prosecution countered with strong evidence, pointing out that the man had not made a single threatening move. They showed frame by frame how calm he had been before being stunned. They reminded the jury that fear alone was not an excuse for unnecessary violence. As the trial continued, the media covered each step closely. News reporters camped outside the courthouse, updating the public on daily proceedings. Television channels ran analysis segments, inviting legal experts to discuss the possible outcomes. On social media, people followed live updates, sharing their opinions and hoping for justice. The case had become larger than just one courtroom. It was now a national conversation about power, fairness, and accountability. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. There were moments when the man's family quietly wiped tears as they listened to his testimony. There were moments when the officer's family sat stiffly, watching their loved one face the weight of serious charges. There were moments when the jurors looked visibly shaken after rewatching the video. Each day felt heavy, yet it also felt important. The man's lawyer spoke passionately, reminding the jury that laws exist to protect every individual, regardless of race or background. He argued that the officer had abused his authority, and that allowing such behavior to go unpunished would set a dangerous precedent. His words resonated with many in the room. The officer's lawyer tried to present him as a man under pressure, someone who made a mistake in the line of duty. They emphasized his years of service, his family responsibilities, and his record of previous conduct. But the prosecution pressed harder, asking the jury to look beyond sympathy for the officer and focus on the evidence of what had actually occurred. The trial stretched on for weeks. Each day brought new arguments, new witnesses, and new pieces of evidence. The man continued to attend as much as he could, supported by his family. His mother often sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly, her face showing a mixture of fear and hope. His siblings stood by him as well, offering quiet encouragement whenever he felt tired. Community members also showed up in numbers. Some days, the courtroom was so full that people had to wait outside. Supporters held signs outside the courthouse, calling for justice and fairness. The presence of the crowd reminded everyone inside that the world was watching closely. The judge remained firm and fair throughout the proceedings. He listened carefully to both sides, allowing them to make their arguments fully. But he also reminded the court that the case was about facts, not speculation. His calm authority helped keep the proceedings steady, even when emotions threatened to overflow. As the trial neared its end, both sides gave their closing arguments. The defense repeated that the officer had acted out of caution, that he had no intent to harm. They asked the jury to consider the difficulty of making quick decisions in the field. But the prosecution delivered a powerful closing, reminding the jury of the video, the witnesses, and the man's own words. They urged the jurors to remember that authority must come with responsibility, and that no one should suffer without cause. The jury then left to deliberate. Hours turned into a full day, and the waiting was difficult. The man sat quietly with his family, holding his mother's hand as they waited for the verdict. The officer sat with his lawyers, his face pale and unreadable. The tension in the courthouse was almost unbearable, as everyone wondered what the decision would be. Finally, the jury returned. The room grew silent as the foreperson stood and read the verdict. The words were clear: guilty on charges of excessive force and violation of civil rights. Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs. The man's family embraced one another, tears flowing freely. Supporters outside cheered as the news spread through the courthouse hallways. The officer sat still, his shoulders slumped, as the reality of the verdict sank in. His family wept quietly, knowing that a prison sentence was now almost certain. The judge scheduled the sentencing for a later date, reminding the courtroom that justice must be delivered with careful consideration. Outside, the crowd erupted with emotion. Some cheered, some cried, and many held each other tightly. It was a moment of relief, a moment that showed that accountability was possible. The man's story had reached its first victory, but everyone knew the journey was not yet over. The sentencing would decide the final outcome, and the impact of the case would continue to ripple through the country. For the man, the verdict was not just about the officer's guilt. It was about his dignity being recognized. It was about his pain being validated, his truth being heard. As he walked out of the courthouse that day, supported by his family and surrounded by supporters, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. He knew the scars of the incident would stay with him, but he also knew that he had stood strong, and the world had listened. The day of the sentencing arrived with heavy anticipation. Weeks had passed since the verdict was read, yet the memory of that moment was still fresh in everyone's minds. The courthouse was once again crowded with people who wanted to witness the conclusion of this case. Reporters filled the sidewalks outside, their microphones and cameras ready to capture every detail. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to hear how justice would finally be measured. The man sat quietly with his family. He wore a simple suit, his posture steady but his eyes showing the weight of what he had endured. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand tightly, while his siblings and other relatives surrounded them for support. They had come not only to hear the sentence but also to stand as a reminder that he was not alone. Across the room, the officer sat with his lawyers, his uniform now replaced with a plain suit. His face carried a mixture of worry and regret, though he kept his eyes down, avoiding the stares of the crowd. The judge entered, and the room immediately grew silent. Everyone rose, then sat again once the judge was seated. The moment felt larger than life. This was not just about one man and one officer. It had become a symbol of accountability, fairness, and the possibility of change. The judge began by reviewing the case, summarizing the facts that had been presented during the trial. He spoke calmly, his voice steady, but his words carried weight. He reminded the courtroom of the video, the witness testimonies, and the jury's decision. Before the sentencing was delivered, both sides were given a chance to speak. The prosecutor stood and reminded the court of the seriousness of the crime. He emphasized that the man had posed no threat, that the officer's actions had been unnecessary, and that such abuse of power could not be tolerated. He explained that law enforcement officers hold great responsibility, and when they misuse that power, the harm is not only to the victim but also to society's trust. The prosecutor urged the judge to send a strong message through the sentencing. The officer's lawyer then rose to speak. He asked the court to show mercy, pointing out the officer's years of service, his family responsibilities, and the pressure of his job. He admitted that the decision to use the stun gun had been a mistake but argued that it had not been made with malice. He requested a lighter sentence, hoping the court would consider the officer's history outside this one event. Then, the man was given the opportunity to speak. The courtroom grew still as he stood, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice clear. He began by describing the pain he felt on the day of the incident, the sudden shock, the collapse, and the fear that rushed through him. He explained how the experience had stayed with him, not only as physical pain but as a heavy memory that followed him each day. He spoke about the nights he lay awake, replaying the moment in his mind, asking himself why it had happened. Yet, he also spoke with dignity. He said that he did not wish harm on the officer, but he wanted justice. He wanted to make sure no one else went through what he had endured. He said he hoped that this case would remind officers everywhere to act with humanity and restraint. His words touched the courtroom deeply. Some supporters wiped their eyes, moved by his calm strength and his refusal to let anger consume him. After he finished, the judge sat silently for a few moments, as though weighing the words carefully. Then, he began to speak. He addressed the officer directly, acknowledging the difficulty of his job but making it clear that what had happened was unacceptable. He reminded the officer that power must always be balanced with responsibility, and that the choice he had made had lasting consequences. The judge explained that this case was not just about a single mistake but about the need for accountability in positions of authority. The judge then announced the sentence. The officer was to serve time in prison, a rare but powerful decision. He also imposed additional penalties, including restrictions after release and a requirement to participate in programs that address the misuse of authority. As the words were spoken, the courtroom erupted with mixed emotions. On one side, the man's family embraced, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Supporters in the crowd nodded, some crying, others clapping softly despite the judge's calls for silence. For them, this was not just a sentence, it was a recognition that what had happened was wrong and that the system had chosen to respond with justice. On the other side, the officer's family wept quietly. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also understood that the weight of the decision was part of a larger truth. The officer himself sat still, his face pale as he absorbed the reality of his punishment. For the first time, he looked up, his eyes scanning the room briefly before lowering again. The silence around him felt heavy, a reminder that actions carry consequences, and no one is above accountability. After the sentencing, the judge gave a final statement. He said that this case should serve as a reminder to law enforcement agencies across the nation. He urged departments to improve their training, to emphasize restraint, and to recognize the dignity of every individual they encounter. He ended by saying that justice is not only about punishment but also about building a fairer society. As court adjourned, people slowly filed out of the room. Reporters rushed to deliver the news to the world outside. The man and his family walked out together, their steps steady, their hearts lighter than before. Supporters cheered softly as he exited, and some reached out to shake his hand. He thanked them quietly, his face filled with gratitude. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was larger than ever. People held signs, waved banners, and chanted for justice and change. When the man stepped out, the cheers grew louder. He raised his hand in thanks but remained humble, reminding the crowd that the journey was not just about him but about everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment. His words, spoken through a brief statement, carried hope and strength. News channels broadcasted the sentencing nationwide. Analysts discussed its significance, calling it a landmark decision. Many noted that cases like this rarely ended with such accountability. They said the sentence sent a message that unnecessary force would not be overlooked. Civil rights groups praised the outcome but also reminded the public that one case alone was not enough, systemic reform was still needed. In homes across the country, families discussed the story over dinner. Parents explained it to their children, teaching them about fairness, courage, and the importance of standing up for what is right. In classrooms, teachers used it as an example of why equality matters. In communities, people saw it as proof that their voices could bring about real change. For the man, the sentencing brought a sense of closure but also a new responsibility. He knew people looked up to him now, not only as a victim but as someone who had faced injustice and spoken with dignity. He felt the weight of that role, but he also felt ready to carry it. He had been through pain, but he had found strength in the support of his community and the truth of his story. That night, as he returned home with his family, he sat quietly for a long time. The noise of the crowd still echoed in his mind, but so did the words of the judge and his own testimony. He realized that his life had changed forever. Though he wished the incident had never happened, he now understood that his story had become part of something bigger. It was a call for accountability, a reminder of human dignity, and a step toward change. The officer would serve his time, the sentence would be remembered, and the man would continue to heal. But beyond the walls of the courtroom, the impact would carry on, shaping conversations, inspiring movements, and reminding people everywhere that justice, though sometimes slow, could still be found. The sentencing of the officer was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a new chapter. The decision in court had sent ripples far beyond the walls of that building, reaching into homes, communities, and institutions across the country. People were still talking about it, still debating what it meant, and still asking what needed to change. For the man at the center of it all, life slowly began to take a different shape. In the weeks following the sentencing, he spent more time with his family, trying to recover from both the physical and emotional scars. The pain in his body lessened gradually, though reminders of that day still lingered in small ways. At night, he sometimes woke suddenly, remembering the moment he collapsed to the ground. But each morning, he also woke with a new sense of strength, knowing that his voice had been heard and that others had stood with him. His neighborhood treated him differently now. Where once he had been just another familiar face on the block, he was now someone people looked up to. Neighbors stopped him on the street to shake his hand, to thank him for his courage, or simply to smile in support. Children waved at him, their parents telling them that he was a man who stood strong for what was right. Though he never sought fame or attention, he carried it with humility, understanding that his story had come to mean something larger than himself. Media coverage continued for weeks, with interviews and features about the broader lessons of the case. Civil rights leaders often mentioned his name when speaking about fairness and accountability. They pointed to his calm testimony in court as a reminder that dignity could be more powerful than anger. His story was shared on television, in newspapers, and online, reaching audiences far beyond his own city. Universities invited him to speak at events, where students listened closely as he described his experience. He always spoke in simple words, never trying to exaggerate or dramatize what had happened. Instead, he explained the truth plainly: he had been calm, he had been respectful, and yet he was treated unfairly. He emphasized that his goal was not revenge, but to ensure that others would not suffer the same way. His sincerity touched people deeply, and many who heard him speak left with a new determination to stand against injustice. Civil rights organizations used the case to push for reforms. They called for new training programs for officers, stricter rules on the use of force, and stronger systems of accountability. They argued that what happened should never happen again, and that preventing it required real changes in policies and culture. Meetings were held with lawmakers, petitions circulated online, and marches continued in different cities. The case had given energy to a movement that was already growing, and it reminded leaders that the public would not remain silent. The officer, meanwhile, began serving his sentence. Though many people felt relief that justice had been done, his punishment also served as a sobering reminder of the cost of misusing authority. Training academies for new officers began discussing the case as an example of what could go wrong when decisions were made carelessly. Some agencies quietly updated their guidelines, hoping to prevent similar incidents in the future. The man's story had become not only a national conversation but also a teaching lesson within the very institutions that once denied responsibility. For the man, being seen as a symbol carried both blessings and challenges. On some days, he felt encouraged by the support of strangers. On other days, he felt the weight of expectation pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew people wanted him to continue speaking out, but he also longed for a return to normal life. To find balance, he spent quiet evenings with his family, enjoying simple things like sharing meals, laughing at old stories, or walking in the park. These moments gave him peace and reminded him of the life he had before the incident. Yet, he could not escape the responsibility that had found him. Slowly, he chose to embrace it. He began working with advocacy groups, lending his voice to campaigns that promoted fairness and respect. He attended community meetings, standing beside families who had faced similar struggles. His presence gave them comfort, showing that they were not alone. He listened to their stories, often with tears in his eyes, and promised to keep speaking up for those who could not. Schools and community centers began inviting him to talk to young people. He told them about the importance of staying calm in difficult situations, about the value of dignity, and about the strength found in truth. He encouraged them not to give in to hopelessness, reminding them that even in painful experiences, there could be light and purpose. The young people admired him, not as a hero from a book but as a real person who had faced hardship and remained strong. The broader society also felt the impact of the case. Conversations about fairness in law enforcement grew louder. Town hall meetings were held where citizens openly shared their concerns about how officers treated people in their communities. Some cities launched independent review boards to handle complaints of excessive force, giving citizens a direct voice in oversight. Across the country, people began asking harder questions about responsibility, accountability, and the dignity of every person. The man's story traveled even beyond the borders of the country. International media reported on the case, drawing attention to the broader issue of human rights. People in other nations read about his experience and compared it to their own struggles with fairness and authority. His courage inspired conversations across oceans, reminding the world that the pursuit of justice is not limited to one place or one community, it belongs to everyone. Months after the sentencing, the man returned to the courthouse, not as a victim but as a speaker. He stood at a podium outside the building, where once he had walked in trembling, and now he stood with strength. He addressed the crowd that had gathered to mark the anniversary of the verdict. His words were steady, filled with humility. He reminded them that while justice had been served in his case, there were many others who still waited for fairness. He urged everyone not to stop pushing for change, not to let the energy fade. The crowd listened intently, many nodding, some wiping tears. When he finished, the applause was long and heartfelt. He stepped down from the podium, not as a celebrity but as a man who had chosen to carry a story bigger than his own. At home that night, he reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the day when his life had changed, the crackle of the stun gun, the cold ground beneath him, the fear that filled his chest. Then he thought about the courtroom, the sentencing, the crowds that had supported him, and the children who now looked up to him as an example. The journey had been painful, but it had also opened a door to purpose. He realized that while the scars of that day would never fully disappear, they no longer defined him as a victim. Instead, they marked him as someone who had endured, someone who had turned pain into strength, and someone who had given hope to others. The story did not end with punishment, nor did it end with protest. It continued in every classroom where his name was spoken, in every family discussion about fairness, in every community that demanded respect. It continued each time someone chose calm dignity over despair, each time someone stood up for another person's rights. For the man, the future remained uncertain, but he walked forward with quiet determination. He no longer carried the weight of fear alone, he carried the voices of countless people who had stood by him. His story had become part of a greater movement, one that stretched beyond him, beyond his city, and even beyond his country. And so, the case of an unnecessary stun gun, a painful fall, and a courtroom sentence lived on not just as a headline in history but as a reminder of what could happen when truth is spoken, when communities unite, and when justice is pursued with courage and hope.